Right, I better get these rewind shafts in place. So I'll start with this one. I'm putting some synthetic grease on the inner portion of the rewind shaft. Slide that in place. It's keyed at the bottom so it only goes in one direction. Take the bush, run some synthetic grease through there. You could use just about any grease you liked in that, really. That bush there is slightly different to the other one. I'll show you that in a second. Let's pop that to one side. That's the later camera. This is the earlier camera. So the inner is the same. The shaft is the same. The bush is different. The bush here is a one-piece arrangement. You can see the piece here that forms the detent. Slide that shaft in there. Sometimes it's handy just to lift that detent up slightly to allow that to slide through. There we go. Now this one's from the later camera. You'll see there's no obvious detent on the outside of that. There's a little copper or a brass band inside there that provides some friction to stop that from floating about. Okay, well I will fit the screws to retain those. And that's the nuisance of not having the tripod socket in place. As soon as you press down on the top, the back door opens because you're pressing on the release button. Do those two screws up tight. So as you can see, with the difference in the bush for the rewind, there is a growing number of changes made to the Retina III small C cameras during their production run. Right, with that in place, just push that up. That's better. That shaft where I can do something useful with it. What I'm interested in here is putting a rubber band around here to the shutter release so that the shutter release is held firmly in place. It's not going to fall out if I tip the camera upside down. And the same on this one. Because that would be a major nuisance if that shutter release falls out when the front's extended. That sleeve has a nasty habit of falling out. And when it falls out, it has a nasty habit of falling down in the gap between the shroud and the bellows. And then you've got to pull all this out in order to fish it out and get it back in place. So it's a nuisance well worth avoiding. Okay, well with that little piece out the way, I'll start putting the focus mount assembly back in place. So we'll extend the front. Here's the focus mount, and I'll start getting that fixed in place. Four screws hold the focus mount to the front standard. And this part of the job is much the same for both of these cameras. The focus mount only goes in the camera one way. There's a notch at the top here which lines up with a hole here in the front standard, and that's for the arm for the rangefinder to pass through. Alright, with those in place, I'll just tighten those screws up. And here I'm supporting the camera with my finger so that I'm not pressing down on the front, collapsing the front and loading up those two spring buttons. Alright, well that's good, that's in place. And the focus helical, I've got this marked, of course. I can see two marks across here and one across there, so that tells me where the two marks are. That's going to be at the base. But more importantly, I can see where it lines up with the outer helical, and I'm just checking to see where those lines come to, and where I've got those marks aligned here and here. My inner is sticking out too far, so if I move it one more position, re-engage that multi-start thread and see where we come to. Now my inner and outer are sitting at the same level. That means that's the correct position. The inner and outer are correctly positioned relative to each other. I'm just checking the feel of that, making sure that moves nice and smoothly. Sometimes after it's been cleaned you're left with a slightly rough finish, probably oxidized surface there, makes it feel a little bit rough. And polishing the two together like this, particularly with a drop of naphtha, often just rubs those rough spots off completely. But that looks good. I'm just going to apply some helical grease there now. And you don't need lots of this. It's put on fairly sparingly. I usually put a little wipe on in about 5 or 6 places around the outside like that. And work it in. Check that it runs smoothly. If it's too tight at that point, it probably means you've put too much grease there. I'm running some around the outside where this is going to run in the mount. And where these two screw holes are visible at the top there, I'm going to put a touch in that notch, top and bottom, because that's where the inner runs on the focus, on the standards here, the posts. Right, this only goes in one way. I've got the two marks at the bottom, so I know it goes in this way. Drop that into place and check that it moves smoothly. That seems fine. I'm putting some grease on this. This is the retainer ring, and you can see 4 bright areas on this where it's mostly been contacting that ring there, the outer helical. So I've just put a wipe there. It doesn't need much. Put that into place and put the screws in there. Now there are 4 countersunk or flathead screws that hold this together. Whoops, just drop one down inside there. I'm going to have to get that out before it decides it's going to hide in a corner somewhere or get stuck in the grease, and then I'll have to dismantle the camera to get the thing back out. So let me get these other 3 started. And see if I can shake that other one back out. Yes, success. Now, those 4 screws, I'll do them up. I can check that focus scale ring, the outer helical, make sure it moves freely. It's looking good. Now I want to connect the bellows to this. Let's make sure that shaft comes up through the hole there. That's better. And the 4 screws that hold the bellows to the back of the front standard can drop into the mount here. Don't go mad doing these screws up. You are not pulling together 2 metal components directly. In between them there'll be a layer of folded over bellows material, which will be a sandwich of leather and cloth, and so it's got a little bit of give to it, so the surfaces don't come up hard and suddenly like 2 pieces of metal. So don't over tighten the screws, looking for that point where things stop moving. You'll just end up breaking the screws. With that in place, I can put my focus scale ring on. Now the focus scale ring, I've got marks there, top and bottom, scribed across here and here, and that's held in place with 4 small screws. Now the process for both of these cameras is exactly the same for this focus part, so I will not go through it again with the other camera. It's going to be exactly the same thing. Just run those screws down. Slacken them back a little bit. I'm just going to check the alignment of that ring to make sure I'm happy that it's sitting in the right spot. That looks good. These screws do not need to be screwed up very tight. They just need to be nipped up and no more. If you over tighten them, all you'll achieve is you'll distort things and then the mechanism will not move smoothly. This coupling for the rangefinder. Now this has been through the ultrasonic cleaner and it's completely devoid of any lubricant. So it's a bit stiff at this hinge joint here, which is only a rivet. So what I'm going to do here is put a blob of grease on there, and through the magic of hydraulic pressure force that with my thumb, and that'll just push it into the joint, and it all moves nice and smoothly now, and that can go on the camera. So wriggling this in is always a little bit of an act. But what we're wanting to do is line up the 2 holes here at the front and the hole on the arm at the top, which I can't quite see at the moment. Where's it gone? It's just sitting across from where it should have been. Let's get those screws in the front piece first. These are smaller than the 4 screws that held the focus scale ring in place. They look much the same, they're just one size smaller. If you put a screw in the wrong place, it's going to be a nuisance to you, so best not to do that. Get the second one in place. Get those screws started. Now I've got to get that arm across. because it's not where I want it to be. I just need to push that arm across, so I'll just poke in here with a rule and I can just see the tip of that arm visible there in the hole. So I'll put its fixing screw in place. That's this black one. That's the post that pulls the rangefinder arm forward. If I can get this started. A magnetised screwdriver here. It's magnetised screwdrivers are a blessing or a curse, often simultaneously. Right, so now I'll take that rubber band off temporarily so you can see. As I move the focus scale ring here, you can see that that post pulls forward and or goes to the back. That's for coupling to our rangefinder. Now normally I'll put a little bit of grease in there. And as the front of the camera's collapsed, let's just make sure that shaft comes out. That arm tracks back down the top of the camera and disappears back out of the way. And as it comes forward, it comes back to the part where it's just running forward and back. And that's the working range of that arm. So that is good. Let's put that rubber band back on there so I don't lose anything. And I'll duplicate this process with the other camera because there's nothing different there. Well, I have both cameras to the same stage now, and I've got to put the shaft in that couples to the shutter at the front of the camera. Now this is the later camera, and you can see the shaft here has got a collar on it, and the shaft is supported directly in the front standard. So I'm putting a bit of grease around the outside, a wipe down the middle where it couples over that shaft, and usually just a suggestion of a wipe on the front so it doesn't rub on the little chrome cover. And that should slide down into position. And if I pull the front up, I can put the cover in place, and the cover is held in place with two chromed brass screws. The screws are quite small, they're brass, they're fairly soft, and it's not hard to make a mess of the screw head. If you make a mess of one of the screw heads, put it down here. People can't see that. Keep the pretty one at the top. So I'll just tighten those two screws up, and that's the coupling in place, and that couples from the front here right through to the shaft at the back with its little gear which is driven by the cocking rack. So that's all good. That's that one. Now that was the later camera. This one's the earlier camera. Now this one was different. To start with, instead of the shaft being supported directly in the housing, this has no collar. It runs through a bush, and the bush fits onto the front standard here. So you can get that in place. And this shaft, we want some grease on the outside where it runs through the bush, a wipe through the centre where it runs over the shaft, and the usual suggestion of a smear of grease on the front so it doesn't rub on the cover. That slides in, and pull the front up and put its cover in place. Same deal with the screws. Be very careful with them, they're easily damaged. And if you make a mess of one, hide it down here where no one can see it. Just check that doesn't rub on anything. Okay, so we've got both cameras back to that stage, and I can fit the front doors. This is the later camera. And take some synthetic grease, wipe it in that slot, wipe it in that slot at the base of the camera. On the arm here, I'll just rub a little bit on the inside of that arm and hook these into place in those slots, and just drop the door into place like that. Now, we had one thick washer at the top here at the hinge pin. I'll slide that into place. And put the hinge pin screw in position. Turning it over. I have a washer here at the base. I think I've got two washers there, and I think we can fit both of them in, so I'll do that. I've got another very thin shim washer here as well. See if the pair of them will go in there. Looks like they'll go in. Line that up. Put the hinge pin screw in place and run that in. Check the action of the door. It opens and closes nicely. And its mate over here, this being the earlier camera, I've got to just do exactly the same. Now in this case, the washer was stuck on the bottom of the door. That pivot point there. I still haven't decided how that happened. It's like it's melted its way into the paint. Put this washer in at the top. Line up the hole and put a hinge pin screw in place. And that washer of course is stuck in place at the bottom, so it's less of a fight to line things up. Check the action. That opens and closes nicely too, so both doors back in place, both cameras ready to have the film advance components put back. Okay, let's carry on with this. So there's the little bush that goes under the film cassette, get that into place, and there are 3 screws that hold that in position. Now, these screws are a little bit discoloured because the base of the camera had obviously been put down somewhere damp at some stage. This is the later camera. I'll do those 3 screws up nice and tight. Pop that to one side. Its mate over here, the earlier camera. We'll get this one in place. These screws are not rusty because this camera was never put down somewhere damp. In fact, they're unusually bright. Do those 3 screws up tight. Now when I bang the camera on the bench, the back doesn't instantly spring open, which is a relief. Okay, so back to the later camera. The lock lever and the release lever I need to put in place now. So I've got some molybdenum paste on this toothpick, and I'm just running it through these holes in the base and along that surface where the spring, the return spring on the release lever will run, and on these 2 holes on the top of the camera. Next I've got to put the spring back on the release lever, on the base of the release lever, and I've got that sitting right here. And I can see that it looks a little bit distorted, so I'll see what I can do about that. Yeah, that looks good. It wasn't much, it was just sort of a little bit open. It wasn't lying all in one plane. Now I've got to get this hooked over this boss here. It's always a bit awkward. I'm sorry you can't see through my fat thumb. That's live. Okay, so that spring is now seated on that boss. Start here with the lock lever, drop that into position, supporting it with my finger from underneath. Put its return spring on the top. Now there are 2 springs that look much the same. One of them has fewer coils and is a lighter gauge of wire, and that's the one that goes over the lock lever. Now this is the piece where practice helps. I'm supporting that lever from underneath with one finger. I'm going to hold the spring down at the top with my thumb so it's compressed beyond the point where the groove in the shaft is, and then I can slide that circlip, that little E-clip, into place, and then with the tail of my tweezers just clip it into place. Now my lock lever moves nicely. The release lever drops in at the bottom of the camera. Now watch that arm on the spring. You don't want to catch it over the lip of the body. It should move up against the inside here. to make sure it's not folded back in some uncomfortable position. I'm supporting that with my finger from underneath. I can put its return spring on the top. That's the spring with more coils and slightly heavier wire, and get the screw started. Now this is tricky because it's going into a split shaft, and it's sometimes awkward to get the thread started. Oh, it's just starting. Okay, so I can wind that down until the spring is just under tension. If I hold this shutter release arm upwards and rotate the shaft at the top, it should clear that screw head just, and at the moment it's not, so I can put another wind on that screw. That's it. So that's in place. And I can duplicate the same thing with this camera, the earlier model, because everything is exactly the same.